Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me in the back all right? Very good. First things first, I'd like you all to just take out your cell phones and make sure you have it turned to silent or off so we don't get disturbed during the talk tonight. My name is Renee Legrade. I'm professor of history at the university and a member of the Governor's Council for the Wyoming Suffrage Celebration. This is a group that got together 3 years ago or so under the auspices of Robin Hill. And it's a group dedicated to bringing awareness of and sparking conversation on Wyoming's historic role in granting women the unrestricted right to vote and political equality in 1869, a full 50 years before the passage of the 19th Amendment. Yeah, all right. So I am delighted to welcome you tonight to tonight's lecture, Inspiring Women, presented by Susan Stamberg. This is the final event. Yes, all right again. This is the final event of a day-and-a-half-long symposium that has brought together nationally renowned scholars on suffrage and has also included University of Wyoming students, young scholars sharing their in-research progress on topics and kind of expanding the boundaries of what we've done on research so far. It's been a fabulous experience, and I hope I can, well, actually looking across the audience, I can see many of you were at the symposium today and last night as well. It takes a great deal of effort and financial support to put together a symposium like this, both from within the university and from outside organizations. And so I'd like to introduce three people tonight who have helped make this keynote address possible and who will say a few words of welcome. Millard Simpson from the Wyoming Humanities Council, Jim Garrison representing the University of Wyoming, and Christina Kuzmich from Wyoming Public Media. And the first person I'd like to introduce is Millard Simpson. Millard has enjoyed a diverse career in the arts and humanities, parks and recreation, and conservation. He has served as executive director of the Wyoming Arts Council, director of the Wyoming Department of State Parks and Cultural Resources, and Wyoming State Director for the Nature Conservancy. He currently serves on the board of the Wyoming Humanities Council. So please come on up. Thank you.
So I was amused to read the list of reasons to vote against women's suffrage put forth by the National Association Opposed to Women's Suffrage in 1911. Here's what was listed on this postcard. Because 90% of women do not want it or do not care. Because it means competition of women with men instead of cooperation. Because 80% of women eligible to vote are married, it can only double or annul their husband's votes. How dare you annul our votes? Because it can be of no benefit, commensurate with the additional expense involved. Sorry, ladies, we just can't afford it. For it is unwise to risk the good that we already have for the evil that may occur. And because in some states more voting women than voting men will place the government under, horror of horrors, petticoat rule. I'm very honored to be one of the folks who has an opportunity to introduce Susan Stamberg tonight. I will confess being somewhat starstruck, all things considered, having been a constant companion of mine since my undergraduate days. And needless to say, like many of us from the first time hearing her voice, I was smitten by Susan Stamberg's intelligence, her warmth, her thirst for knowledge and discovery, and the enthusiasm and passion for her work that just kind of leaps out of the radio when you're listening to her. I'm also honored here to represent Wyoming Humanities, and just a couple of words about our organization. The humanities are the study of humanity in its most whole sense. They're the study of not only our past, present, and future, but rather the full fiber of our being, The humanities beg us to ask questions that give insight into the creative imagination and the culture that surrounds us. They are the study of how people process and document the human experience of what human beings have thought, felt, created, and celebrated. We were founded in 1970. In 65, under LBJ's Great Society, the National Endowment for the Humanities was created. Wyoming was one of 6 states in 1970, that piloted the State Humanities Council model. Next year is our 50th anniversary, and we're proud to be one of the oldest humanities councils in the country. We bring the humanities to Wyoming people in basically 3 ways: through grants to nonprofit organizations, through conversations on humanities topics that we sponsor in communities around the state, as well as through our What's Your Why podcast series, and through collaborations with in-state and national organizations to bring special humanities programming around the state, such as our traveling exhibits with the Smithsonian. So Wyoming Humanities has also been proud to be involved with the sesquicentennial celebration of women's suffrage. In 2016, our wonderful executive director, Shannon Smith, was appointed to be on the Governor's Council, which was put in charge of helping the state celebrate this special occasion. We've also recently made several women's suffrage-related grants, including a grant to Sublette County Libraries in support of Wyoming Women Then and Now, a month-long celebration of Wyoming women, a grant to Wyoming PBS to complete their State of Equality women's suffrage documentary, and a grant to Washakie Museum in support of their exhibition entitled The Vote, Women's Suffrage, Wyoming and Beyond. And finally, please go to our website and listen to this wonderful series of podcasts called First But Last. And it was created to amplify women's issues, elevate the state's conversation about women's equality, and be a resource for organizations and individuals seeking to support women's equality. It's interviews with some incredibly impressive Wyoming women. None of this would be possible without federal funding from the NEH and also funding from our state legislature. And speaking of impressive Wyoming women, here in the Year of Wyoming Women, I just want to give a shout out to my wife, Amy, who is an award-winning teacher and public education advocate, and my mother, Lynn, a Governor's Arts Award-winning community theater producer and director, 2 powerful women who continue to devote their lives to advancing Wyoming. So with Wyoming Humanities being a proud funder of this symposium, I am naturally delighted to report to you and to emphasize that Susan Stamberg has been described as, quote, the closest thing to an enlightened humanist on the radio. And enlightened humanism being in somewhat short supply in our current cultural milieu, I think we need as many of these voices as possible today. Thankfully, one of those voices is here with us this evening, and I'm thrilled to be one of the people to welcome her to the Equality State. Thank you.
The support for this symposium from across the university has been amazing, from faculty and staff in my own department, from the School of Culture, Gender, and Social Justice, the College of Arts and Sciences, College of Law, Honors College, to the President's Office. Dr. Jean Garrison, Director of the Office of Outreach and Engagement, is going to say a few words of welcome for the university in general. So welcome, Jean.
So behalf on Acting President Neil Theobald and Provost Kate Miller, I have the privilege to welcome you all to UW and this keynote address tonight featuring NPR award-winning broadcast journalist Susan Stamberg. I have to acknowledge that when I told Provost Miller that you were coming, she said, "Are you going to bring us some relish?" And I'm committed to making it this year. So she really did send that to me in the email, honestly. So I just have to share their regrets. They're unable to be here tonight. But that means I get to be here to be the one to welcome you on behalf of the university. It's really my pleasure to say thank you to Dr. Renee Lagrade for bringing this program to us tonight and this lovely symposium on women's suffrage in the Northern Plains. Could we give her a hand, perhaps? It goes without saying that at the university, when events such as this symposium and the keynote talks that have been associated with it, it's just terrific to have students involved in this. And that's been one of the hallmarks of the work that Renee has done in this symposium. But it also shows her commitment on behalf of faculty like her on this campus. So that's really a special thing. And I just want to acknowledge that that's something that is something we do here at the University of Wyoming, and I can't think of a person who does it more than Renee. I've heard how well it's been in terms of attendance, and I'm just so pleased that all of you were here to enjoy the dialogue. And actually, believe it or not, this is lovely weather, okay? It's a good thing you weren't here last week. It was probably about 60 degrees difference. The Suffrage Symposium is a signature event in the UW Women's Suffrage Celebration, which over the next year will feature a number of events, programs, exhibits, and performances. We've placed a rack card in your seat listing many of those forthcoming events over the next academic year. Please keep an eye out for updates on those events through the Office of Engagement and Outreach website. But we will continue to update those events across the year. With partnerships such as Wyoming Public Media, the Wyoming Humanities Council, and the Governor's Council on the Wyoming Women's Suffrage Celebration, we at UW are able to be part of a wide effort around the state to highlight the history of 150 years of women's suffrage in Wyoming, which of course it's already been said, but it's worth saying again, which makes us a leader 50 years before we marked this accomplishment in the United States. Remember that it was on December 10th, 1869, that John Campbell, then governor of the Wyoming Territory, approved the first law in U.S. history explicitly granting women the right to vote. 20 years later, on November 5th, so we're only 3 days off of that 130th anniversary, we see that Wyoming voters approved the first constitution in the world, granting full voting rights to women. It's significant. So that's what we've done. Celebrations like this mark what we have done. They also mark what we need to continue to do. And I think it's really important that tonight, Susan Stamberg is focusing her comments on inspiring women. By the way, Susan, you are one of those women. I doubt you're going to be highlighting what you do, but we do know what you have done and what you will continue to do. And inspiring women has been a focus for me in my teaching for the last 24 years, much of it here at the university. I look forward to focusing on this in my own work, and I believe that this sets a tone, and your topic on inspiring women, it sets a tone for getting women and our citizens involved in thinking about what we need to continue to do for the next 150 years. Welcome to Wyoming.
And last but definitely not least, Christina Kuzmich, General Manager, Wyoming Public Radio and Media State Network at the University of Wyoming. She's been instrumental in bringing Susan Stamberg to Laramie and for supporting the symposium. Welcome to the podium.
Good evening, public radio listeners. I'm assuming if you're here, you know Susan, you must be listening to public radio. Thank you. This year, we honor Wyoming's trailblazing women. And they're the ones who make a difference in Wyoming, be it with their vote or with just their charisma. And tonight, we have one of NPR's trailblazing women with us in Wyoming. NPR has always been a mecca for female reporters. Journalists like Susan Stamberg, Cokie Roberts, Nina Totenberg. These were the backbone of public radio. They became known as the mothers of NPR. And public radio veterans all over the country will tell you that without these three women, NPR would not be what it is today. They were all special, incredibly talented, dedicated, and they had incredible chutzpah. Susan holds a unique place in broadcast history. The night in 1971 when she opened the microphone for All Things Considered and became the first woman nightly news broadcaster was an inspirational moment not only to the women in public broadcasting, but to public broadcasting in general. And the thousands of journalists who are working today, including the 11 who are at Wyoming Public Media, they owe much of what they now know and their craft to people like Susan Stamberg. Susan was inducted into the Broadcast Hall of Fame and the National Radio Hall of Fame, among many, many other awards. Currently, she serves as special correspondent for NPR. But I have to say that despite all of these incredible achievements, accolades, the one thing that people always mention when you say the name Susan Stamberg is Mama Stamberg's cranberry relish recipe with onion, sour cream, and what's that last ingredient? You got it. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to introduce Susan Stamberg and welcome her to Wyoming.
Thank you. Thank you so much. She actually gave most of the recipe, and I'm so sorry I didn't have a tape recorder here, because at the moment I am scrounging for an idea for what to do this year. And this would have been so perfect, an entire chorus of horseradish. Thank you so much. Lovely introductions from everybody. I appreciate a lot what you said, and I like to see such a full house here and all your shining faces. I have had a grand, I don't know how many hours it is yet, time in Laramie, Wyoming. I never thought in my life I would ever get here. Never occurred to me. I can't say it was a major aspiration of mine for, between Paris, Laramie, I don't know. I went to Paris a lot, but I'm here now, and I'm very happy about it. And I had such a great day, thanks to Christina and staff members, Raya, others, took me around. We had a grand lunch with a lot of movers and shakers of your community, and I got that wonderful sense, which you don't so much in Washington, not only not these days, but really ever, and I've lived there a long time, of community. That feeling of community that you all have, and the wonderful chance to make community here, knowing how important it is, how necessary it is for you. So thank you for the invitation, and I'm awfully glad I accepted it. I've got a lot to say. These are my spontaneous ad libs. And as you've been told, the subject is inspiring women. And I'm going to talk about a number of them, beginning way back in the 1850s in France. The painter Rosa Bonheur, her specialty was painting scenes of enormous animals, powerful animals. The best-known picture of hers was called The Horse Fair. She needed a permit to wear pants in public. She had to have a health official's signature notarized, saying that it was okay and a medical necessity for her. And that permit had to be renewed every 6 months. Now, granted, Rosa would go clomping through the farmland to paint her horses and her cows and whatever large veterinarian subjects she might encounter in the course of it, and she needed very sturdy boots in order to do that clomping. And pants, as we women know today, thank you, were very comfortable with her boots, very practical. She became known for what she wore and what she painted. She was an extremely successful and rather briskly selling artist. 20 years later, Wyoming men, as you said, feared petticoat rule. So what is it with you guys in our clothes? What difference could that possibly make? It's up here. That's what counts. And in here, too, as well. But I like fantasizing about those 19th century Wyoming women who I bet you were just troublemakers, right? And constant nags. And really fighting for the rights that they had and the things that they thought were so important. And shaping the state, that's what's so interesting, in order to get what they wanted. and it wasn't an easy road, I'm sure. I'm going to talk about some successful and actually inspiring women today, but first about women wearing the pants, or at least getting the right to vote here in Wyoming. Yes, to me it's so moving to think that I'm standing on the land of the very first place in the world who guaranteed that extraordinary privilege and responsibility. And when it came time to exercise the privilege, it was Laramie's Louisa, come on gang, you knew horseradish, you can do Louisa, Swaim, yes, incredible. The first to do it, to vote in a general election, 1870, 50 years before the 19th Amendment. I met her today, or at least her statue. And we stood in sort of a holy circle, lunchmates and I, at her feet in order to get our picture taken. And I asked somebody who was there to please send me a copy of it, because that's something I'll put up on my office wall. It was terrific to see her, and you could see the determination in her face, big time. Of course, let's admit it, it took men to grant that privilege, as it took men to make all the official decisions back in those days, and in these days too, very often. But they did it, and they did it right here. They supported and protected women's rights. You all know much more about all of this than I do. I'm a native New Yorker, after all. And you know how provincial we can be. So I don't know if you've ever seen that Saul Steinberg cartoon. I think it was a cover of the New Yorker magazine years ago. The New Yorker's view of the rest of the country. New York was this big. There was Texas. I don't know I don't even know if Wyoming made it on his map. But I mean, that's how we are. You know, you have to live with it. But I've been so fascinated to hear the stories and just breathe in the same air. In the reading I've done, getting ready to talk with you, and the Wyoming State Historical Society have a lot of useful information. I've been very interested to learn what was behind the decision, especially that Wyoming knew that their efforts would make news, not fake news, mind you, but news, NPR kind of news, and put the territory in an attractive light to attract attractive, with any luck, women to come out here and help populate the place. That's a worthy ambition. There were 6 grown men for every adult woman then. There were other reasons for sure, but I really like that one in particular because it's so practical and just the sheer romance of it, don't you think? When I'm done, I'd love to hear your stories, actually, if we have time for that. Favorite stories about Wyoming women getting the vote. It took some 50 years, I think, to actually commit the act of voting here. But now I'm going to move on to stories of some women who were mostly born into a world where women vote, here in this country and also overseas. To me, they're inspiring women, and they are modern pioneers. They're risk takers, and they're revolutionaries. 2 of them are very well known. One is Georgia O'Keeffe, sound a familiar name to you. The other is Miep Geese, and that's a name that won't be so familiar to you. But she is the woman who found and saved the Diary of Anne Frank. And I'll also talk about 2 who are not that well known, but they certainly deserve to be, as you will hear. But first, the woman who inspired us all, and that is Mother. And here's a little book with a big reminder to me to take my glasses. You know, 30 years ago, I didn't need to write little notes like that to myself. Something must have happened, I don't know. I reported on NPR a while ago about the work of a Boston artist named Sarah Hutt. Sarah was 13 years old when her mother died of breast cancer. And something struck her, just trying to remember her mother, hold on to memories of her mother. She sat down one day with old photographs and objects that had belonged to her mother, and she began to create a 1,000-line poem filled with memories of that woman she lost. And then she put them into a book. And I want to just read a little of this, just a little, because I think it could be a wonderful project for all of us to try to do something like this. Oh, wait a minute, I forgot glasses. Give me a moment. My mother wore a girdle. My mother taught me how to draw a tree. My mother said, don't run with a stick. My mother taught me how to knit. My mother liked to iron clothes. My mother was glad to see me. My mother made lasagna sandwiches. My mother said there's no two ways about it. My mother liked to knit with purple yarn. My mother liked to put together jigsaw puzzles. My mother said, just wait till your father gets home. My mother always bit the side of her mouth. My mother was always putting her foot down. My mother liked to lay in the grass and watch for shooting stars. My mother said, always tell the truth. My mother said, biting my fingernails causes appendicitis. Isn't that terrific? The details are different, but Sarah Hutt's mother, and I love her name, Carmelia Louise Ann Napitano Colonisi Hutt. She reminds us of all, either our mothers or mothers whom we have known in the course of our lifetimes. Miep Gies was a mother, but that is not what brought glory and fame to her. She died in 2010 at the age of 100. And I was lucky enough to have met her in her early 90s when I went to Amsterdam to do a portrait of her, a radio portrait. I met her son, Paul, at the apartment. She was a grandmother 3 times over. But of course, the child most closely associated with Miep Gies is Anne Frank. And there were photographs and paintings of Anne all over Miep's small apartment. There was also some furniture that had belonged to Anne's family. Miep had been Otto Frank's secretary. And when the war was over and when all the Franks, except for Otto, were dead, he came to Miep and he moved in. He lived with her and her husband for several years. He had no place else to go after all of that. He'd been at Auschwitz and by some miracle survived. So he lived with them for several years, and then he got married again, and he left Holland. And it was at that point that he gave Miep a desk and a beautiful old grandfather clock and a cabinet that had been in his home. Several strokes had slowed down her speech by the time that I got to meet her. But she was fit and she was quick. She had snowy white hair. She had pink, ruddy cheeks, a very quiet, a proper person, and very, very determined. And meeting her, you could see her not accept any help in carrying coffee into the living room. No, don't. I don't need any help. I'll bring out these cookies. No. You began to understand the kind of strength that brought her through those terrible war years, when she was the one who helped the Frank family, the Van Pelts, the dentist, all hide in a secret annex behind Otto Frank's office on Prinsengracht. She shopped and smuggled food to those 8 people every day for 25 dangerous months. And in her own apartment, she hid a young Jewish student. And she never told Otto Frank about that because she felt it was too dangerous. She knew it was very dangerous what she was doing, but she didn't want to worry him. She figured he had troubles enough. So here's a total of 11 people dependent on her to buy food with forged ration cards. I am not a hero, Miep Gies insisted. In fact, those are the very first words of a memoir, a wonderful book that she wrote with help from Alison Gold. It's called Anne Frank Remembered, and it was made into an Academy Award-winning documentary. I am not a hero. But Miep Gies risked her own life every day for more than 2 years to help, and after the family was taken, she went down 2 times to Gestapo headquarters in Amsterdam to ask that they be freed. Now, can you imagine doing that and the bravery, the guts that took, walking in that way? She could have been arrested herself on the spot, but she went. And by some miracle, she wasn't arrested. But to the end, Miep always insisted she was not a hero. She felt that in her heart, she had failed. She knew she'd provided sustenance to all of those people. Yes, and she had kept the red plaid diary that she had rescued when the family was taken away. When word came that Anne Frank was dead, Miep turned the diary over to Otto Frank without ever having read it. She never read it, and she had it for about 2 years by that time. In fact, she didn't read the book until it was in its second printing. She felt that it was so private, and she felt that she had failed. She had a dream, and her co-author, Alison Gold, told me that one day she would go upstairs to the hiding place on Prinsengracht and throw open the door and say to them, "Now you can all go home. It's over." That was Miep's dream, and it didn't come true. Of course, she was thankful that she had saved the diary, and she knows what a legacy her young friend had left. But she wished her Jewish friends had lived, even if it meant Anne's diary was lost to the world. And every year, on the 4th of August, Miep Gies observed a day of silence to mark the arrest of Anne Frank and the others. Every year, a silent remembrance. I want to read one more tiny little thing from Sarah Hutzbach, and then we'll go on to George. Oh, again, I'm forgetting my glasses. Yeah. My mother noticed the little things. My mother did 11 facial exercises. My mother said, "It's what you don't do that makes the difference." My mother always took our picture on the first day of school. My mother asked, "How did you let things get to this?" My mother liked to rest her eyes. My mother could account for things. My mother took a deep breath before she spoke. My mother said, "Trust your own judgment." My mother kept an eye out for me. I love these. You know, you could, she did 1,000 lines like this, and I tried to do it once too, and I think it's a really good exercise, and maybe all of you, or many of you anyway, will think about doing something like that. It's a very fine way to recapture someone you've lost in these specific terms, specific details that bring them back to you and let you live with them again for a little while. Next, Georgia O'Keeffe, who inspired us by changing what it was we saw in the last century. Her work is reproduced on posters, notepaper, postcards, and it's always unmistakable. First and foremost, she's an image maker rather than a great painter per se. Her brushstroke is kind of flat, it's dull. She doesn't have any impasto on it or dimension to it. I like gooey paintings myself, but her colors, the compositions, and the things that she chose to paint at a time that nobody was painting them, that's the impact. That's the contribution that she made. Georgia O'Keeffe is one of the most important female painters ever. She started out as a fairly traditional one. She did a lot of clumsy still lifes, dead rabbits, copper pots, that sort of thing. But she broke away from the traditions and she developed her own aesthetic. She was certainly Our Lady of the Bones and Stones. Her images, flowers, bones, mesas, and her aesthetic, which was filling space in a beautiful way. And she even meant filling the space of an envelope, if anybody remembers envelopes and stamps. If you're going to use a stamp, put it on the envelope just so that it makes a nice composition for you to look at, and the post person too. And there's a certain Asian feeling to her work, pared down lines and contours, curves that are almost like calligraphy at times. So also these extreme close-ups, I don't know if you've ever seen them, of flowers. They're really striking. It was a technique, by the way, influenced by photography. She was married to Alfred Stieglitz, who was one of the great early photographers of our country. The camera, the way a camera's zoom lens can get you very close, even closer. She did that with her paint. And the colors that she did, the petunias, so purple and deeply cushy, you want to rest your head on them for a while. Calla lilies that are white, except for all the color that she pours on them. They look like satin gowns. That anybody know the name Jean Harlow, the old movie star, very sexy, sort of an early Marilyn Monroe? It was like the satin gowns that Jean Harlow would wear. I want to tell you about meeting Miss O'Keeffe. It was a long time ago, before most of you were born. It was 1983, right? Right. Hold on, I need to get some water. Your altitude is drying me out. So you won't mind if I take the occasional swig? To your health. In 1983, she was 96 years old. And she came to Washington for the opening of an exhibit of photographs of Stieglitz. Juan Hamilton, who was a sculptor, who was her companion and assistant in the last decades of her life, he was a listener of mine. They put up a special antenna on their house in Abiquiu so that he could hear All Things Considered better. And he invited me, it was such a privilege, to join them for a preview an hour before the show opened to the public. It was a wonderful invitation, but of course I was so cool, I said, well, I'll have to check my engagement book and see if I'm free. So I'm standing in front of the National Gallery. It was a very chilly winter day. Taxi pulls up. It was early morning. And I gripped my microphone, I adjusted my tape recorder, and out of the cab steps a tall, slim, he was actually a gorgeous man with a full, sensuous, dark mustache. He said a quick hello. We had met earlier at a gallery in another part of Washington. And then he turned back to help the passenger. And out into the thin sunlight of that February morning emerged Georgia O'Keeffe. Black coat, a silver pin. Alexander Calder made it for her. He made it in the shape of her initials, O.K., but he did it with beautiful curves and flourishes. And Juan said, Georgia, this is Susan Stamberg. We listened to her in Abiquiu. And she looked at me, she peered at me. And she didn't, I wouldn't say she smiled exactly. She showed some teeth. Her manner was very open, and her face was soft. And despite her great age, 96, she walked very purposefully into that museum, and we wandered around. I held my microphone out from time to time as she looked at things, just to kind of capture her voice. And at one point, she noticed, and she said, "What are you doing?" She croaked at me. And I, very sweetly, I said, "Well, I'm recording, Miss O'Keeffe," and one signaled me to please move off, which I, of course, did. So I ended up with a tape full of off-mic and mostly totally unusable, although extremely rare, Georgia O'Keeffe, who never gave interviews. And I put it in a carton on a shelf in my office thinking, maybe it'll marinate. You know, the magnetic things in it could come together and it'll get loud and we'll understand her. Guess what? I still have the tape, never happened. But I want to tell you what I remember about that morning, that her voice was cracked by age and years of determination, that her hearing was very bad, and that Juan Hamilton was wonderful in the attention that he paid to her. She was nearly blind by then. And as she approached various Stieglitz photos, she had to press her face very close to the image just in order to see it. And Juan always stood close by. He held her arm. He anticipated her needs, just the way a mother does with a little child. It was really very caretaking. Helpful, steadying hand at the small of her back when she would sway a little bit, chatting smoothly and smoothing her way through the wearying gallery corridors. It was a big exhibition, and it took a long time, the walking. At the end of the morning, when we said goodbye, he took me aside, and he said, "Please, Susan, don't tell how bad her eyes are. She wouldn't like that to get out." And I honored his request in the report that I did about that morning. I felt that it really didn't add anything to my story, which was a story about Stieglitz's photographs, to describe how age had marked his widow. And I also wanted to respect Juan's wishes in thanks for his enormous generosity in letting me be the only other person there that day. I have to say, I thought about it a good deal after it happened, and I know now, I really realize that it is a decision that other reporters might not have made. We live in much more an age of gotcha journalism than it was in 1980, whatever that year was. But the grounds for deciding not to honor the request, they do exist. She was still creating artwork. She was still selling them. If the word got out that her eyesight was poor, that just might have influenced sales. It could have gone up or down. He may have had a commercial and a personal stake in keeping that information quiet. I may have been used. It's always a risk. It's a risk for every reporter. But, I just did what I thought was right. So that's Georgia O'Keeffe. She taught us about filling space in a beautiful way, one of America's early modern artists, although her subjects are always recognizable. But she abstracts them down to their pure essence, and she makes us see in a new way. And to me, that was very, and still remains very, very inspiring. Next, somebody whose name you won't know, a woman who helped me to look beyond what I could see, beyond the paintings that I take a look at every day these days as a cultural correspondent. I'm not a news hen anymore, which is why I'm not talking politics with you. And in Washington, I can't tell you what a relief that is. Anyway, but Betsy Wilson is a truly inspiring woman. She started out as a school teacher. She loved her little town of Concord, Massachusetts, and she was very proud to drive me around the town to show it off. And there I kept my tape recorder out and running as we drove. And later we went to her house for an interview. And when I got back to Washington and began to put her story together for a broadcast, I very deliberately chose to begin the report with the sound of her in her car chattering away about Concord, stopping off at the library, the post office, greeting her pals, calling out hellos. So for the first minute or so of the story, that's what you got to hear. Betsy Wilson trundling along in Concord, having a wonderful day. You couldn't help but enjoy being with her. She was warm, she was enthusiastic, she was generous, and then very slowly, I unfolded her story. Betsy Wilson founded an organization called Let's Face It. It's a support group for people with severely disfigured faces. She had had cancer of the jaw, and many, many surgeries removed her jawbone and then rebuilt it. Her face was askew. She had lovely bright blue eyes shiny eyes under these straight, brown, shining bangs that she wore. And then she had a mouth and a jaw that were crooked, disfigured. Some of the parents of her students objected. They didn't want their children to be taught by a person who looked like that. When she goes out, she encounters stares, and worse than that. Sometimes she's ridiculed, sometimes people taunt her. And instead of collapsing under the burden of that, remarkable Betsy Wilson created a support group for people like her. Let's Face It put men and women and children together who were making and have made this extremely difficult adjustment. There were telephone networks, and Betsy herself was on the phone all the time, unless she was giving lectures at hospitals and medical schools or coming to Washington for a conference. And when she came to my town, she always got in touch, and we would meet, have breakfast together or something, just spend a little bit of time together. The last time I was in touch with her, she had moved to Bellingham, Washington, not far from one of her sons, so she had left New England. And I gave a lot of thought to the way I told her story on the radio. I decided that I wanted listeners to meet her, be with her by tape, enjoy her for a while before I reported her disability. And so I told it on the air exactly the way I've just told it to you, a story that started with 2 minutes of us driving around town together, me talking to a lively, funny, delightful stranger. Listeners got a chance to meet the real Betsy Wilson and then learn about her disfigurement. This is one of radio's great advantages, I think, on a story like this. On television, the very first thing you would notice was her face and that jaw, and you would be distracted by it for a while. It would take you away from who she was and what the things were that she was saying. On radio, you could absorb all of this before you knew what she looked like. On radio, you got to like a stranger and her talk, and then you were ready to listen, as you all have been, with compassion to her story. A story which is full of inspiration and beauty to my way of thinking. Last lady, and I can't really leave without telling you about my all-time favorite inspiring woman. Her name is Lily Sannasi, and I met her quite by accident at the Luxembourg Gardens in Paris. I'd gotten off a bus, and I was walking across the park, through the park, to a friend's apartment. And sitting there, as I passed, was a small white-haired woman in a khaki jacket and blue slacks and a pork pie hat crushed down on her head to protect her from the bright sunshine. It was a gorgeous day. But the hat was not her most distinguishing feature. It was a sign that she was holding on her lap. That sign was French on one side and English on the other. In great big letters, the sign said, "Let's talk." Well, how could I resist, you know? I talk to strangers all the time, whether I'm working or not. I walked over to her, and she said, "Would you like to know about my sign?" Of course I would. She explained that her goal was to get strangers talking with one another. And I said, "Well, you know, in America, I talk to strangers too, on the radio." And she started twinkling. She said, "Well, don't you want to interview me?" "Well, do lobsters want to fly? I ask you." Of course. We made a date. And the next evening, at 6:30, I went back to the park. I had my tape recorder in hand. And there she was, sitting in a circle, surrounded by 3 gentlemen, all of them just talking away. And I joined them with my microphone and learned that Miss Lily is, at that time she was 81 years old. She lives in Brussels, but she visits Paris very often. And when she comes, she finds the Luxembourg Gardens a perfect crossroads for her mission, to get strangers talking together. She thinks that there should be talking space in public places, just as there are places for smokers, and that people should feel free to come there. No cost, no obligation, no names, simply to chat. She wants to start a world movement of talking. She carries her sign with her wherever she goes, at home when she's in Brussels, when she's standing online to get into a movie or to get into a lecture. She holds up that sign and she sees who reads it and comes over and begins to talk to her. Or when she travels, she takes it along with her as well. She thinks people are lonely and that we crave conversation, but we don't know how to start. And Miss Lily and her sign helps them start, us start. She has some rules. There will be no politics, no religion. She says wars begin that way. But if those 2 subjects are avoided, understanding, she thinks, can take place. Lily Sannasi speaks 5 languages. She worked as an interpreter for many decades. And ever since she retired, she took up this cause. She says she herself is never lonely. She has lots of relatives and friends. But she thinks that the world would be a better place if more of us talked to one another. And so she becomes a facilitator. A man couldn't do it, she says. A young girl couldn't do it. It must be an elderly woman. Because, this part is very depressing, an older woman is safe, not threatening. She didn't know Louisa Swain. She knows it's very odd sitting in the sun inviting conversation. She says, people look at me as a little bit crazy, but I think the world is crazy enough that to be crazy among them is more a compliment than a shame. So, there you have Miss Lily Sannasi and her philosophy of life. We parted with huge hugs and smiles. And as we spoke, sure enough, several people came over. They joined the circle. They began chatting. And people would come and people would go throughout that early evening. I tell you that I was walking on joy when I left her. I went back a few days later just because I just was dying to see her again. She wasn't there. And in a way, you know, I was glad because it had been so perfect that Sunday afternoon in the park with Miss Lily, best to keep it as a marvelous memory, as an inspiration. Now, I'm going to wrap up because I'd like to hear some questions from you, but I'd really like to hear Wisconsin women's stories. So, where am I? Although Wisconsin women have some very interesting stories. But let them stay home and tell them, I want to hear yours. Oh, that's so embarrassing. I usually do know where I am. There's plenty that I don't know, but that much I know. Anyway, forgive me, Wyoming. I want to hear your stories, especially about women. But a broadcaster's first obligation is to get off the air on time, and I believe my time, this much of it anyway, is coming to an end. In fact, Bob Edwards, anybody remember him? He was I saw him day before yesterday at NPR. We celebrated the 40th anniversary of Morning Edition. And there was a lovely celebration. People got up. They put all the hosts, a history's worth of Morning Edition hosts, up on a stage. And they talked in such extraordinary ways. And you were just sitting there realizing, you know, I'm a founding mother of the place. But you look at that and you think, what has come out of all of this? What have we done? Look at this institution. I cried 2 times. Those darn hosts got me crying with their stories. It really was something. But anyway, I saw him the other day. Bob was there, and he says that what he wants on his tombstone is, he got off on time. But his one-time wife, Sharon, had a better epitaph. Sharon Edwards wanted her stone to read, "Thin at last." Me too. Anyway, happy anniversary to you, Laramie, Wyoming. Thank you for creating the path to equality. Now go vote. It's a sacred duty. Don't stay home. If you can't drive or you can't get there, get somebody else to give you a ride, but go out and commit the act of voting. You're in the place where it started. So, thank you. Thank you. Good. Can I ask for a question? Thank you so much. You're a wonderful, attentive audience. Please, I'd love to hear some questions or stories, whichever you feel like doing. And there are microphones.
Just please walk up to the microphone.
Yeah, let us hear you. Oh, don't be shy. Oh, good. No. Come on, Wyoming, I need to hear you. There have to be at least some questions. You don't want to know what Bob Edwards is really like? There's nothing that, no cure. Oh, here you go.
How were you ever so brave at the time you started in radio to do what it was you did? Because that was a time when women weren't doing those things. How did you become so brave?
Well, thank you. I don't know. I didn't look at, although I was pretty scared. I can remember the first day. But I'd done a lot of radio locally at the station at American University in Washington, which is the only other radio job I ever had. And I didn't go to school there, but that station, again, it turns out, I realized the other day, I was a founding mother of that too. I was their first full-time employee. And I was so good at it, they made me the station manager. But that was only because the manager himself left. And there was a staff of 3. So they had somebody to turn to, and it was me. So I'd had a lot of experience. I wasn't afraid of microphones. But I had listeners only in one place. And here, this was now going to be a national audience. And so I certainly, I remember that colleagues there, Linda Wertheimer and I were the first employees, the longest lasting of us, of all of us. And I'm still there. I'm still working. I'll never quit. But Linda remembers seeing me the day that I was to do All Things Considered for the first time, not eating my lunch. And she knew there was something really wrong. Gee, she's not eating her lunch. Something's going on with Susan. But there was tremendous support there from the women I was working with, as well as the men. It was men who decided I should be the one and made all the major decisions that gave me the job. But to begin with, I wasn't very good, even though I'd had quite more experience on a daily basis, because I did such a program at WAMU. Still, I hadn't been in that kind of powerful chair. Although in those days we had 68 member stations and about 68 staff and maybe 68 listeners. So it wasn't we were just starting, you know. But in the beginning, because there were no role models for me, there were no other women doing this, and very few female reporters, let alone anchors, all I could think to do was to imitate men. And so I lowered my voice, and I tried to sound as authoritative as possible, and sounded ridiculous, as you just heard. But the man who created All Things Considered, our first program manager, a man named Bill Siemering, who still pops in every now and then, and we look at him as if, oh, the saint has arrived, let's go see him. He said a wonderful thing to me. It was just so helpful. He said, be yourself. You know, how many people in this world will say that to you? They'll say, stand up straight, or lose 10 pounds, or go bake a cake, or something else. There's some kind of change that most people want in us, except for Fred Rogers. He was the only other one who ever said, I like you just the way you are. And Bill essentially was saying that to me, that this was good enough. Speaking in this conversational way, I was the voice he heard in his head to be the anchor of this new and very experimental and unusual network. So I owe him that debt. And the fear went away. I was having such a good time that I couldn't be frightened for very much longer. But thank you for saying that. I guess it was bravery. I just thought, get it done, get it done.
With regards to that, then, did you determine what programs you were going to do, or where did the input come from?
Oh, did you hear her question? Okay. No, I didn't. I'm lucky enough these days to be able to decide what I report on, and that is such a privilege. It's an extraordinary generosity on the part of the network. But no, in those days, we were a news program. We did our best to be a news program. And so the news dictated what it was we were going to cover every day. But I did the arts stuff as sort of the end of every half hour. And that was always sort of the icing on the cake for me, or the cupcake. Just as what got me through really awful and heavy news days, knowing, because my passion was always the arts, that I'd have a novelist to speak to at some point that afternoon, or a painter, or a creative person. But we had almost no resources at the beginning. We had 5 reporters. How many do you have now? Your staff is 11? I mean, this is really fabulous. It's fabulous. Cultural and news. We had no such luxury. We had nobody overseas. Robert Siegel was our first foreign correspondent. But we were ambitious about doing daily news. And so Bill, again, made an arrangement with the Christian Science Monitor, which was a first-rate newspaper in those days. We started in 1971. And they had correspondents all over the world. And so the arrangement was anytime news was breaking anywhere, Ouagadougou or Paris or wherever, we could telephone one of their reporters and put them on the air. And they were superb, first-rate reporters. So that's how we did it. But it took many, many years to get the density. Density is not a good word to use about our reporters. The intelligence and brilliance of our reporters in that wonderful array and in the numbers that we're opening bureaus in places where most other news organizations have closed them. But I never would have dreamt when we were starting. As I say, it was always ambitious, and we knew what our goal was. I never would have dreamt that we would end up like this. Essentially, the last ones standing as far as broadcasting serious news. Every taxi driver in... Yeah, it's amazing. Diane Rehm, was her program on here for some time? She would have open house from time to time for the cab drivers of Washington, to invite them in, give them a little cheese, a little wine, because she knew that they had captive audiences all day, right? First of all, they wanted to hear, they're mostly foreigners, at entry-level jobs in D.C., and they wanted to hear foreign news, and they couldn't hear it anywhere except our programs. They heard news of what was going on in their homelands. But also they had these captive audiences, so whoever the passengers were might just get caught, hear something really good and decide, oh, what's that? And maybe I'll go listen to that too. So it was very canny of her. Did I answer that question? I do tend to ramble, Wyoming. You have to lasso me back. Let's have some more questions. I really like them, but I won't keep you too long here. Yes, hi, good. Oh, wait a minute. No, keep going. You'll be next. Somebody's making her way to the microphone. Yes. No, but sir, you go first, since you did.
The wonderful quotes you shared with us, the 1,000 things my mother said.
Yes.
With your unique style and your conversational warmth, and I always feel when I'm listening to you on the radio as if I'm listening to a beloved sister or a favorite aunt. And I wonder if there was anyone in your life or background that your family might associate you with, and say she reminds me of.
Well, my mother, who had this beautiful voice. She wanted to be an opera singer, and she was never quite at that level. But her speaking voice was beautiful, was lilting. And I loved her reading to me, and she did from the cradle practically. And it was wonderful to hear her rhythms and the patterns that she made with her voice. You still today on the radio and certainly in real life hear people who are speaking of monotone, they have no music to their voices at all. But my mother did. That opera aspiration was with her all the time. So yeah, she influenced me that way. But she never made lasagna sandwiches, I will say that. Oh, and the awful thing, now sometimes people very kindly invite me to dinner and they say, is there anything you don't eat? And the answer is tongue. But my mother loved tongue. That was really her only flaw. Yes, thanks for waiting so patiently.
Earlier you mentioned going to Paris.
Yeah.
What's the most interesting place that you've ever found yourself for a radio story?
Oh, for a story. Well, it could be Laramie, Wyoming, if only I brought my tape recorder. We still call it tape recorders, by the way. We haven't had tape in about 20 years, I think, but that's good. Well, I lived in India for a while. My late husband was with the Foreign Aid Agency, USAID. And he was posted there. This was a long time ago in the 60s, but that was an infinitely fascinating place to me. And it was wonderful to work there because there was so much. We used to play a game, those of us, the Americans who were in that crowd then, of turning 360 degrees wherever we were and looking for something that looked familiar, and you never found it. It was all so. Has anybody gone to India? Yes. So you know what I mean. Right. Just infinitely fascinating. Oh, I'm so glad you went. Good. Good. You did? And would you answer the question the same way? That India was one of the most fascinating places? Yeah. Anybody else? Yes, here comes a candidate.
In talking about the woman who holds up the sign and we chat,
Yeah.
I just wanted to recognize someone in our community who's here. Nancy. She can be seen standing downtown protesting. She's an
Like
anti-war
this, huh?
protester. And
Is that so?
as I know it, I think she's a veteran, and she sees it as her duty to
Veterans for Peace, I see the sign.
speak out for peace.
Yeah. Can I interview you very quickly here? You go to the microphone, please.
Yes, ma'am. How can I help you?
So tell how you do it and where you stand. Are you in a very public, central place here?
I'm actually at the
second most trafficked intersection in Laramie.
Wow.
At 3rd and Grand where two highways meet. I was just a couple months short of 24 years in the uniform of the United States military.
Oh.
That was not service. That's what you do with your car. I upheld and defended the Constitution in Standing Rock, first time. And I've been now in my 17th year. Well, science says honk for peace, and science says veterans for peace. When I hit 24, I'm quitting. Be back to square one.
Whoa. And what do you feel you've achieved?
For half an hour every week, people are aware that we are at war. Or shouldn't be. It's time to stop.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And do you get odd looks? What's the response if people drive past you, or do you get heckled? Do you get taunted?
The heckling and taunting is pretty much stopped tonight. Now, actually, Grand Avenue was closed, so it was only a three-way intersection.
Oh, yeah.
And I got more honks than I normally do because nobody had to worry about people left turning.
I think it's better that way with the honks.
The best heckling I ever got was a four-door pickup truck and two guys on the passenger side mooned us when there was a group. For 3 weeks, I brought my squirt guns and fire extinguishers. It was dead of winter. They never came back.
Waiting. Thank you very much. And thank you for your work in behalf of the country. Anybody else? Should we call it a night? Oh, no, you. Come on.
I just have one more.
Yes.
In today's climate, there are numerous unwarranted attacks on the fourth estate, on journalism, commentary, if it doesn't agree with the president. Unfortunately, not everybody in the United States listens to public radio. I wish they did,
Me too.
but they don't. So how do we get the public confidence back
In our society.
our society?
Right.
Like our news, you know?
Right.
All this crap about false news, alternate facts. What do we do about it?
Well, we keep broadcasting is what we do. I don't, I'm not a politician, so I don't have an agenda or, a plan of action to be able to tell you. And I'm as concerned as you, in fact, more concerned, because it's just such a tainting of what we're trying to do. And if citizens are not informed about what's happening in the world and are told that it's fake and are told and lied to, how do we maintain a democracy? This is a very serious time in our country. And so your questions are spot on to undermine any kind of confidence and trust, but it's happening with so many of our institutions now. And it's happening within the journalistic community as well, as stations ride their own hobby horses, Fox News, for example, that will not give you the broad sense of what's happening in the world, but only such narrow and narrower senses in reporting. It's so hard for citizens to be able to sort through that. Not public radio listeners, I'm such a chauvinist for it, but most others, if they're paying attention at all. Social media goes to a certain length in recreating a balance, but it has its own problems and creates its own problems as well. So that's certainly not as an entirely trustworthy source. I'm sorry, but I don't know. I don't know. All I know is to keep doing what we do. Yeah, hi.
Just the subject that I wanted to raise. We should tell you that Louisa Swain was not the very first woman to vote under general and unconditional female suffrage. Only so if we qualify that by saying our suffrage was permanent and included the right to hold office as well. So the reason I bring this up is because it's a fact. It's a historical fact, and it seems like that should matter. We should be careful about this. We're going to try to be careful about this. And I wanted to also relate that to journalism and ask if you have any advice, any way to steer journalism toward facts, toward objectivity, which does seem to be lacking in many quarters, but I guess you've already answered that question.
I hope I have, with no answer, no definitive, no plan of action, as
Right,
I say.
right.
I don't know, and many of us are really in despair about this, just as citizens of the country. I don't mean just, I mean with the privilege of being citizens in this country. That's something I learned in India, living there. That's the world's largest democracy. It's a miracle of democracy, given the breadth of that population and something like 18 different dialects that are spoken and so little cohesion, and yet democracy keeps them together, and they take advantage of the vote, and the dream of voting remains. Do you remember when the South Africans got the first chance to go and vote, the blacks there, and the lines that just went around the block? They understood the preciousness of this in ways that sometimes we forget. But honestly, I wish I had answers for you. I don't, except to just do what we do more and more and better. That's all. Are we done? Great. Thank you so much. You're a lovely audience. Thank you.
Oh, I never got whistled at. Thank you all.
And I'd like to invite you all to stay around. There's refreshments outside, and you'll have a chance to chat some more. So thank you for coming tonight.